Super excited to share the Word of God with you today. This morning, we're going to be continuing our sermon series called Walking with Jesus, where we've been discussing some spiritual disciplines that we are invited to partake in, to deepen our love and knowledge of Jesus as we walk with Him today. And so last week, we talked about the spiritual discipline of prayer and how it forms us and shapes us. Today, we're going to continue on the topic of prayer, but we're going to focus in more on the practical side of private prayer. And to help us do this, we're going to walk through some different passages in the book of Luke, because Luke's gospel walks us through different stages of Jesus' life. You know, we see how he was born, and then how he went to the temple each and every day. And then we see how he was baptized and immediately sent by the Spirit out to the wilderness, right? And then we see how he started his public ministry. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on how he started his public ministry, because a lot of things were happening for Jesus during this time. People were starting to hear about his miraculous ministry and his healing ministry, right? Large crowds were starting to listen to Jesus when he would speak, right? And large crowds were starting to follow him as well, so much so that he had to appoint leaders amongst his followers who are known as his disciples. And so things were getting really busy for Jesus. But what did Jesus do when life was getting busy? He made time for prayer. He made time for prayer. We see this in several different parts in the Gospels, right? And we see this also confirmed in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus, after praying or after proclaiming the good news of the gospel to the crowds, he'd get away from the crowds. He'd get away from the busyness and from the noise, and he'd go to a quiet place to pray to God the Father before continuing to do the work of ministry, right? And so with that brief context in mind, the main idea today that I want you to remember, and the main thing we're going to be unpacking today is that amid a busy world, we're invited to focus on what matters the most, a prayer life spent with God. I'll repeat it again for those who are note takers. This is the important thing we're going to remember today, is that amid a busy world, we're invited to focus on what matters the most, a prayer life spent with God. See, here's the thing. We all live busy lives, right? I'm sure most of us can open up the calendars on our phones and see that we have a lot planned for today or this week or this month, right? We have meetings and appointments and hangouts scheduled, right? And we love to jam pack our schedules with a million things, and then we wonder why we're always in a hurry, right? And even when it comes down to just slowing down, we'll, sit on the couch, but instead of truly resting our bodies and our minds, we just distract ourselves with exorbitant amount of times on our phones, social media, or binge watching TV, right? And so we all live busy, hurried, and distracted lives. And the truth is that it's become our normal way of life. When we were considering moving up north, Leah, my wife, took a solo trip to visit the offices at her, what would be her job, and also was doing some house shopping in Ardmore, where we currently live. Now, this was obviously before we knew anyone in this area, let alone our church family. But I remember her recalling an incident that she had while she was taking that trip, while she was driving through Ardmore. She said that she was at a stoplight, and she said within not even a half a second that the light turned green, she had several cars behind her honking their horns at her to hurry up and drive. And who knows, maybe it was one of you guys, we wouldn't know. Maybe you were in a hurry to Carlino's or Suburban Square, but whoever it was, it's lucky I wasn't in the car, because we would have had some issues, No, I'm kidding. No, but she realized that Philly and the Northeast is super busy and is just so much more fast-paced than other cities and other areas around the U.S., right? And so that's the truth. The fast-paced life is the normal way of life here. We all live busy, hurried, and distracted lives. But I doubt that I have to stand here and prove to you that we all live busy, hurried, distracted lives, let alone live in a super busy area in the United States. But even though we know this, what are we doing to counter it? Even though we know that life is busy, it doesn't seem like we're doing anything about it. And see, the thing about living busy and distracted lives, especially as followers of Jesus, is that we become less and less aware of God's presence in our lives. We know theologically that God is always present everywhere, right? But it's us who become less aware of God and less present with others and less present with God, right? And if we keep on letting it go down this path, it's going to lead us to burnout, exhaustion, isolation, depression, and anxiety, and so forth, right? So, what is the answer then? The answer to a busy and distracted life is not more time. You know, we think if I had 2 more hours in my day, if I had 4 more hours in my day, I'd get this, this, and this done, right? The reality is we wouldn't use our time like we think we would, right? And so the answer is not more time. The answer is actually to slow down and focus on what matters the most. You want to know what Jesus did? He prayed because prayer helps us focus on what matters the most in this life, which is time spent with God. And so let me ask you this. What matters the most to you in this life? What matters the most to you in this life? Is it your family? Is it accumulating money, growing your career, accumulating generational wealth, so forth? Now, I'm not saying these are bad things, but is this what matters the most to you in this life? You know the answer to that by being honest about what do you spend the most time on? What do you spend the most time thinking about? Now, if we say that, well, God is the most important thing in our lives, right? Then spending time with Him would matter, don't you think? Spending time with Him would be important, right? See, time spent with God is found primarily through His Word, but also through prayer. And a life of prayer was central to Jesus. So, therefore, as His disciples, it should be central to our lives as well. See, Jesus' prayer life wasn't just this support for Jesus' ministry life. No, it was the lifeline. It was the catalyst for his ministry life. Maybe you're like, well, Jesus lived in the first century and life looked so different back then and the world looked so different back then. Yeah, you're right. But what's been the most important thing that a human being can ever experience in this life, regardless of whatever time period they've lived in, has never changed. A life spent with God, in relationship with God, has and always will be the most important thing a human being can experience. Right? We see that all throughout Scripture. Now, if you remember the last time I preached, I did a brief recap of the prophet Isaiah's core message to the people of God. And it was essentially look to Jesus, right? We look to Jesus for salvation, hope, and comfort in this life, right? Now, the charge, the invitation today is slightly different. It's not look to Jesus, it's look at Jesus. Look at Him. Look at what mattered the most to Him, because Jesus always shows us what matters the most in this life. And as we'll see in our passages today, regardless of however many things are vying for our attention, however busy life gets, a life of prayer matters. And so as His disciples, we are not only called and invited to look to Jesus, but we are invited to look at Jesus and look at His way of life, because His way of life is the better way of life, right? It's the better way of life, and He's our teacher, He's our master, and we are His disciples. And so what can we learn about Jesus' prayer life in the Gospel of Luke? Also, how as His disciples can we do the same things? How can we follow His steps, right? And so the first and primary thing we see that Jesus' prayer life teaches us is this, is that a private and quiet prayer life is necessary. A private and quiet prayer life is necessary. And so let's open up our Bibles to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5, verse 15 through 16. Luke chapter 5, verse 15 through 16. And let's see why a private and quiet prayer life matters and is necessary. But the news about him spread even more, and large crowds would come together to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. Yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed. Now, as I said before while explaining the context in Luke, is that um, Jesus' public ministry had just begun, and things were starting to get super busy really quickly for him. Yet Jesus demonstrates the importance of a prayer life. And verse 16 says that he withdrew from the crowds to go to pray, right? And so the common used phrase for the places that he'd go to pray to were deserted places. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a desert with lots of heat, sand, and no water around, right? No, it's essentially talking about places that were quiet, lonely, and desolate. And common places that were the deserted places that he'd go to would include like the wilderness and the mountains and so forth. Now, essentially, it was places that were places that were far away from the crowds and the noise. It was sacred time and space for Jesus to go pray and get away from all that amid the busyness. And he viewed it as necessary. He viewed it as a necessity. John Mark Comer notes in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of a Hurry, he says, in Luke's gospel in particular, you can chart Jesus' life along two axis points. The busier and more in demand and famous Jesus became, and the more he withdrew to his quiet place to pray. Usually for us, it's the exact opposite. When we get over busy and life is hectic and people are vying for our time, the quiet place is the first thing to go rather than our first go-to. The first thing we lose is unhurried time to just sit with God in the quiet to pray. This quote is so true. We can learn a lot by observing Jesus and his actions, right? We see the busier life got doing the work of the ministry, the more time he made for a private and quiet prayer life, right? But for many of us, including myself, the alone and quiet and private time with the Lord spent in prayer is easily the first thing we push aside, right? But the reality is that many times we end up replacing potential time spent with God in prayer for other distractions. Spend it on other distractions. For example, when my family and I moved here, the kids were pretty young, and Cadence and Lennox hadn't given up their nap time just yet during the day. And so nap time was such a sacred time in our day that I often think about and I often miss dearly, right? Nap time, Lee and I always shed a tear when we realized that it's no longer a thing in our household, right? It was the good old days, and I just wish someone told us it was the good old days. Stay in it, right? As long as you can. But it was really nice when they would go down for naps. The whole house would get super quiet, right? And so it was a time for me to just gather my thoughts and just recoup some sanity, right? But I noticed that when the kids would wake up from their naps, instead of feeling rested and ready to tackle the rest of my day, I wasn't really feeling any of that, right? I started to notice that when the kids were down for their naps and the whole house was quiet, I just fill up my brain with so many other types of noises. It was time for digital overload, right? I'd go to my phone, social media, start watching TV, right? And so instead of using that time for something that was purposeful and restful, I was using it just to distract myself with something else, right? Instead of using that time, that alone, quiet, and private time, to spend it with the Lord, I just use it to distract myself with other things. See, instead of slowing down and spending time with God in prayer in the quiet, we tend to just distract ourselves with some other types of noises, right? And there's so many distractions around us. But for the sake of spending time with the Lord in private and quiet prayer time, which is necessary, it's necessary for the Christian, for the believer, for a disciple of Jesus to do that. We need to fight off the distractions and cut off the additional noises, the access noises in life. And so how can we cultivate a private and quiet prayer life, one that is distraction free? Well, just like anything else in this life that matters, It requires intentionality. Jesus was very intentional with his prayer life, which leads us to another point that we see about Jesus' prayer life that we can learn and follow, is that we need to be intentional in prioritizing prayer. We need to be intentional in prioritizing prayer. And so let's read those verses again. Luke chapter 5, verse 15 through 16. It says, "But the news about him spread even more, and large crowds would come together to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. Yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed." Now, I know that I just read this passage moments ago, but notice verse 16. It says, "Yet he often." See, time with God the Father mattered to Jesus. And so he intentionally made time for it regularly. See, prayer was a regular thing in Jesus' daily life. Tom told us last week that the regular pattern of Jesus' life was proclaim, pray, and then perform those miracles, right? And then he just repeat that cycle over again. It was just a daily part of his life. I got that right? Yes, absolutely. Thank you. But yeah, it was a daily part of his life. Now, if we read these verses, we just think that these moments were just off the cuff, spontaneous moments in Jesus's day, right? But if we see this repeated over and over again in the Gospels, right, over and over again, just written out. It's making the point that it's not just this random off the cuff thing that Jesus would do. No, it was important to Jesus. The point is that it was important to Jesus, and he was intentional about it, right? He was intentional about it. Prayer was something that Jesus planned to be a part of his daily life. See, prayer has to make it into our schedules and into our practices, or else it simply will never happen. Prayer will simply remain an idea rather than a reality. And so we need to fight off the noise, the distractions, and the busyness of life and be intentional about our prayer life with the Lord. I remember early on in our marriage, my wife Leah and I always talked about traveling the world and doing a lot of that, especially before kids. Well, we never got to do lots of it because we were on a very tight budget early on in marriage, thanks to seminary. And so the only places that we got to visit were the beautiful tropical lands of Cleveland and Maryland. I don't know if you've ever been there, and they're amazing. Not tropical, but but yeah, when we got pregnant with Cadence, and by we, I mean Leah, we went to, I decided that it was time to just make it happen, right? And so I bought tickets out to England and France, and we've always wanted to go. And so I just went for it, and I didn't even tell her about it. I just made it happen, right? Now, here's my thinking behind the purchase of those tickets. Unless I actually bought the tickets, it was never going to happen, right? Unless I was intentional and made it happen, right? And just went for it, we weren't ever going to go. Similarly, many of us just need to make prayer life just a reality rather than just an idea. We just need to go for it. Intentionally just need to make it happen in our lives, right? And a great way to be intentional about prayer is to put it on your calendar as a daily or hourly reminder. Just do whatever works for you to prioritize prayer. And you're going to have to be real about it. You're going to have to fight off the distractions in life, right? So if that means that's your phone, turn it off, chuck it into the river, right? If that means going and bashing your TV with the chair, do it. No, I'm just kidding. There's going to be lots of purchases at Best Buy this week. But yeah, just you get the point. Be intentional. Make it a reality, or else it's just going to remain an idea. It's never going to happen. So why does this matter? Why is it so important to cultivate a prayer life with such great intentionality? It's because a prayer life amid a busy world is the most rewarding thing ever. It's the most rewarding thing ever. And that's another thing we learned from Jesus' prayer life, is that prayer life is rewarding. It's rewarding. Look at Luke chapter 6, the following chapter. Luke chapter 6, verse 12 through 13. Luke 6, 12 through 13. It says, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray and spent all night in prayer to God. When daylight came, he summoned his disciples and he chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Now, in verse 12, it says that Jesus went out to the mountain, which is one of his common deserted places that he'd go to, right? And then in verse 13, it says that the following day, he was able to choose who his 12 disciples were going to be. Now, if we read these verses too quickly, we'll think that the main point of this section is that Jesus just went to the mountain to pray just to get discernment who to choose who his 12 disciples would be, right? But verse 12 gives us a super small but yet important and amazing detail. It says that he spent all night in prayer to God. Now, this doesn't really change the flow of like understanding that passage, right? In verse 12, the first half says, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray. You just skip down to 13. When daylight came, he summoned his disciples and so forth, right? You get the gist of what's being communicated, right? But it says that he spent all night in prayer to God. See, I think this is important. Why? It's because the primary reward that Jesus got to benefit from through prayer, wasn't the kind of miracles he was able to perform for people. It wasn't the amount of healings he was able to do for people. It wasn't the large crowds that he was able to attract, right? It wasn't that he was able to discern who his 12 disciples were. All these are good things. They're good things. But the primary reward for Jesus in prayer was time spent with God the Father. It was time spent with God. See, the primary reward in prayer for us is time spent with God in his presence. And I think because prayer has been misconstrued as primarily the way we get things from God, right? The rewards from God, we often feel discouraged about prayer. We think, it doesn't work. God isn't listening to my prayers, right? And so we'll feel super discouraged by that. And we'll think, hey, God doesn't listen. God doesn't hear my prayers, right? But I think we're missing the mark. See, prayer is not primarily about getting things from God. It is not solely about the outcomes, what we deem as positive outcomes. Prayer is about getting God. And what I mean by that is that we get to spend time with our Creator. We get time in his presence. We have his ear. He's listening to us when we're praying. We get to be shaped by his word when we repeat it back to God. We align our hearts to his heart. We align our desires to his desires. Those are the true rewards that come through prayer when we spend time in his presence. So let me ask you this. Would you still be content if all you got from prayer was God's presence? Would you still be content in prayer if all you got from prayer was God's presence? Let me give you some insight. I'm 100% sure that God's presence alone is better than anything, any material thing you've ever asked for or prayed for in this life. Just saying, right? One of my favorite things to do with my son Lennox is going to drink smoothies. He absolutely loves smoothies, and I don't think his mouth ever lifts off the straw like when he's drinking smoothies. So he'll just be there like 5 minutes straight, just like, right? I'm like, you all right, bro? You got brain freeze yet? Like, slow down, take a break, right? But as much as he loves smoothies, I can tell that he loves time with his dad even more, right? Just hanging out at the house, not doing anything, just playing, and I'm giving him my undivided attention, right? Now, yes, I can give him things that he likes and that he wants, right? I can give him those things, like smoothies, right? But I can tell that he loves time, spending time with his dad, not because there's anything special with me. No, because it's time with his dad. And as his dad, I want to be present with him as much as possible. And I want our time together to be meaningful, to be valuable. And this makes me think about how much more valuable our time spent with the Lord is in prayer. Yes, We can get good things from God, right? We can enjoy a lot of things in God, but would we still be content if all we got was his presence rather than the things that we prayed for and asked for? Would we still be content in him? See, the reason I think we aren't content with just spending time in his presence is because we live busy and hurried and distracted lives, right? And we become less aware of the beauty of his presence. But see, prayer is not primarily about outcomes. It's about presence. It's about being present with God and him present with us. Now, don't get me wrong. Yes, God wants to bless us with so many things, with good gifts. He even promises us good things, right, through prayer. But God knows that the greatest blessing of all, that for his children and our greatest good is giving us himself. It's giving us himself, his presence. So we should count any time spent with God, whether it's 1 minute spent with God or whether it's the whole night spent with God like Jesus did, right? We should count that as a win. We should count it all as a win. Pastor Tyler Staton in his book on prayer says, pray as you can. Don't pray as you can't. So, after you leave today, don't be like, Pastor Ricky told us to be challenged to pray. So, I usually did 10 minutes. Now I'm going to do 60 hours this week. Like, it's not going to happen, right? So just pray as you can. Don't pray as you can't. Just add another minute because it's another minute spent in God's presence, right? Jesus knew how rewarding prayer was, and he wants us to realize it too. But we won't realize it. We won't realize how rewarding it is until we slow down. We slow down and focus on what matters the most in this life, which is a prayer life spent with God in his presence. So as we come to a close today, I want to briefly recap everything we've seen. We've seen that our main idea was that amid a busy world, we are invited to focus on what matters the most, a prayer life spent with God. See, our normal way of life is to live busy, hurried, and distracted lives. But as we look to the Gospels and we look at Jesus' life, we see that he shows us what matters the most in this life. Shows us that a private and quiet prayer life matters and it's necessary. And we need to be intentional in cultivating it or else it will never happen. But when we cultivate it, when we make it a priority in our lives, it's the most rewarding thing ever. Why? Because it's time spent in God's presence. That's the most important thing in this life. See, God is inviting us to this better way of life, and he's not looking at us angry because we don't prioritize prayer, right? He's your Father. He loves you. He's extending a gracious invitation to you today to spend time on what matters the most in this life. And so he's inviting those who are busy to slow down, those who are hurried to find rest, and those who are distracted to focus on what matters the most. And so will you accept this invitation from the Lord today to slow down and focus on what matters the most? Prayer life spent with God. The answer is yes. Then follow Jesus. Start to pray. Be intentional. Right? You want to start to pray or you want to pray more often or you want to pray better than you pray right now, right? Then just do it. Just pray. Just do it. Theologian Thomas Merton once said, if you want a life of prayer, the way to get it is by praying. Simple as that, right? If you want a life of prayer, the way to get it is by praying. See, it's never too late to start a prayer life or deepen your prayer life. So just be intentional. Cut off the additional noise in life and remember that the most rewarding thing about prayer is God's presence, not necessarily all the other outcomes. The presence of God is what matters the most in this life. And you can get that through a life of prayer.